She laughed at his plain coffee order, certain he didn't belong in her fancy cafe. But when the truth came out, it left her, and everyone else, stunned. The cafe buzzed with life. Customers sipped on steaming cappuccinos, the hum of quiet conversation blending with the occasional hiss of the espresso machine. The morning sun streamed through the large glass windows, casting warm golden streaks across polished wooden tables. It was a place where regulars came to indulge in artisanal brews and expensive pastries. As the glass door swung open, a towering figure stepped inside. Shaquille O'Neal, dressed in a plain gray hoodie, dark sweatpants, and scuffed sneakers, stood out against the meticulously dressed crowd. His unassuming outfit and gentle demeanor were in stark contrast to the cafe's high-end ambiance. Shaq scanned the menu board, his eyes lingering briefly on the list of elaborate drink options. Latte macchiato with oat milk, triple shot espressos with caramel drizzle. None of it interested him. He stepped forward, his massive hands resting lightly on the counter as he offered the barista a warm smile. "Just a black coffee, please," he said, his deep voice calm and polite. The request was simple, too simple for a place like this. Emma, a young waitress stationed nearby, raised an eyebrow. She had noticed Shaq the moment he walked in. His height and casual attire had already drawn her judgment, but this order, it cemented her assumption. "Black coffee?" Emma muttered, loud enough for her colleague behind the counter to hear. "Guess he's not here for the experience." Shaq caught her tone but didn't flinch. He simply handed over a crisp bill, took his receipt, and moved aside to wait. Emma couldn't help herself. She approached with a smirk, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "You sure you don't want to try something a little fancier? Maybe a caramel latte or, I don't know, something you've heard of?" Shaq turned to her, his expression calm but unreadable. "No, just black coffee. Thank you." Her smirk deepened. "All right then. Simple taste for a simple man." Emma strolled back toward her station, muttering under her breath. Her words weren't meant for him alone. Patrons seated nearby exchanged uneasy glances. A woman at a corner table leaned toward her friend. "Did you hear that? She's being rude." Shaq remained still, waiting for his coffee. His calmness seemed to unsettle Emma, who glanced back at him, hoping for a reaction. There was none. He accepted his drink with a quiet, "Thank you," and moved to a corner table. From across the cafe, a young professional named Lisa watched intently. "Why is she acting like that?" she whispered to her colleague. Her friend shrugged, unwilling to engage. But Lisa's gaze stayed fixed on Shaq, who sipped his coffee, opened a notebook, and began jotting something down. He seemed at peace, but there was an unspoken energy about him, calm yet commanding. It was as though he knew something no one else did, something that would soon change everything. Shaq sat quietly in the corner, his massive frame hunched slightly over the small table. The plain black coffee in his hands was a sharp contrast to the elaborate drinks surrounding him. The warmth of the cup seeped into his palms, but he barely sipped. His focus was on the notebook open before him. Emma, however, couldn't let it go. Her smirk grew as she leaned against the counter, glancing his way. "I don't get it," she said to her colleague, her voice loud enough for Shaq and several nearby patrons to hear. "Why even come here if all you want is black coffee? There's a gas station down the street for that." A ripple of unease passed through the cafe. Lisa, still watching from her table, shook her head. "This is getting ridiculous," she muttered to her friend. Shaq didn't react. He turned a page in his notebook, his pen moving slowly, methodically. Emma wasn't done. She approached his table, tray in hand, her expression a mix of arrogance and feigned politeness. "Can I get you something else? Maybe a croissant? Or is that a little too fancy for you?" Her voice was honeyed, but the sting of her words was unmistakable. Shaq finally looked up, his deep brown eyes locking onto hers. "Thank you, but I'm good," he said calmly, his tone unwavering. The lack of reaction seemed to frustrate her. "Suit yourself," she muttered, spinning on her heel and heading back to the counter. A few patrons exchanged glances, their discomfort growing. Lisa leaned closer to her companion. "She's really trying to push him. Why? He's not even doing anything." Across the room, Marcus, one of the baristas, had also noticed. He stepped closer to Emma, his voice low but firm. "Emma, maybe take it down a notch. He hasn't done anything to deserve that." Emma scoffed. "Oh, come on, he doesn't care. Look at him. He's not even paying attention." But Marcus wasn't convinced. He glanced toward Shaq, who was now jotting something down in his notebook, his expression unreadable. As the minutes ticked by, the atmosphere in the cafe shifted. The light-hearted chatter dulled, replaced by hushed murmurs and sidelong glances. Emma, emboldened by the lack of intervention, grew louder. "Bet he doesn't even know what a cappuccino is," she said, laughing to herself. Shaq stood up. The simple act was enough to command attention. He walked toward the counter with deliberate steps, the notebook still in his hand. The room seemed to hold its breath. "I'd like a refill, please," he said, his voice as calm as ever. Emma raised an eyebrow, clearly amused. "Another black coffee? You really know how to mix it up." Shaq didn't respond. He handed her the cup and waited patiently as she prepared his drink, her movements deliberately slow. When she handed it back, she leaned in slightly. "You know, most people who come here want an experience. But I guess you're not most people." Shaq's lips curved into a faint smile. "You're right. I'm not." The response caught her off guard. For a moment, she seemed unsure of what to say, but as he turned and walked back to his table, her frustration boiled over. She glanced at Marcus, shaking her head. "Seriously, why do we even let people like him in here? He's just—" Her voice trailed off, but the damage was done. Several customers heard her, their expressions shifting from discomfort to outright disapproval. Lisa's patience snapped. "Unbelievable," she said, loud enough for Emma to hear. Emma shot her a glare but didn't respond. The tension in the room was thick, and all eyes were on Shaq as he calmly resumed his seat. He took a slow sip of his coffee, his composure unshaken, but the air crackled with anticipation. Something was coming, and it was clear Shaq was waiting for just the right moment to act. The cafe buzz had dwindled into a nervous hum. Emma's remarks hung in the air, impossible to ignore. A few customers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting side glances at Shaq, who sat quietly at his corner table. Shaq's calmness was unnerving. He sipped his coffee, flipped a page in his notebook, and continued to write. His movements were deliberate, his expression unbothered. But his presence carried weight, an unspoken command for patience. Emma, oblivious to the unease she'd created, continued her performance. She leaned against the counter, her voice just loud enough to carry. "You'd think someone that big would order something bigger than a plain coffee. Maybe he's just cheap." A sharp intake of breath came from Lisa, who sat near the window. "Is she seriously still at it?" she muttered to her friend. Lisa's companion shifted in her seat. "She's going to regret this. Just watch." At that moment, Shaq stood up again, his towering figure instantly drawing attention. He walked to the counter, placing his empty cup down gently. "Excuse me," he said in his deep, calm voice. "May I get another refill?" Emma turned, her smirk firmly in place. "Another one? I guess plain coffee really is your thing." She grabbed the pot with exaggerated slowness, pouring the black liquid into his cup. "You know," she added, her tone dripping with sarcasm, "we do have a loyalty card. Might help you save up for something fancier next time." Shaq's lips quirked into a faint smile. "That's thoughtful. Maybe I'll look into it." Her attempt to rattle him failed, yet again. The patience in his tone made her falter for just a moment before she scoffed and turned back to the counter. It was Marcus, the barista, who finally broke the mounting tension. "Emma, can you stop?" he said, his voice low but firm. Emma turned to him, her eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Stop what? I'm just doing my job." "No, you're not," Marcus replied, his voice steady. "You're embarrassing yourself. And the rest of us." Emma opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, the sound of the cafe door opening interrupted her. A man in a tailored suit walked in, his polished shoes clicking against the floor. It was Mr. Carter, the cafe's manager. His sharp eyes scanned the room, lingering on Shaq before landing on Emma. "Good morning, everyone," Mr. Carter said, his tone polite but firm. He made his way to Shaq, extending a hand. "Mr. O'Neal, it's good to see you again." The room froze. Every head turned toward Shaq, whose calm smile remained unwavering as he shook the manager's hand. "Good to see you too, Mr. Carter," Shaq replied. Emma's face drained of color. "Mr. O'Neal," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Carter turned to her, his expression unreadable. "Emma, this is Shaquille O'Neal, one of the co-owners of this cafe." The words hit like a thunderclap. The room, already quiet, descended into absolute silence. Lisa's jaw dropped. Her friend covered her mouth in shock. Shaq stepped forward, his towering figure now impossible to ignore. "I like to keep things simple," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Sometimes simplicity tells you more about a person than anything else." Emma stammered. I didn't know." "You didn't," Shaq said, cutting her off. "And that's the problem." Marcus stood by, his eyes wide but satisfied. Mr. Carter's expression darkened slightly as he addressed Emma. "Step aside, Emma. We'll talk about this later." Emma backed away slowly, her hands trembling as she clutched a tray. Shaq turned to Mr. Carter. "Can we have a quick word with the staff? I think it's time for a little team talk." "Of course," Mr. Carter replied immediately. "Give me a moment to gather everyone." The cafe felt different now, charged with anticipation. Lisa leaned toward her companion, whispering, "I knew something was off about how calm he was." "He was waiting for this." Shaq returned to his table, picking up his notebook. His composed demeanor never wavered, but his gaze carried an intensity that couldn't be ignored. As the staff gathered, Emma stood in the back, her face pale and her hands clenched tightly. She knew this wasn't just a simple talk. This was her reckoning. The cafe staff gathered hesitantly near the counter, the tension in the air thick enough to cut with a knife. Marcus stood off to the side, arms crossed, his expression a mix of relief and quiet satisfaction. Emma, on the other hand, lingered in the back, her usual confident demeanor replaced by visible unease. She fiddled nervously with the edge of her apron, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Shaquille O'Neal stood in the center of the room, towering over everyone. Yet his presence wasn't intimidating. It was commanding. His calm, collected demeanor made the silence even heavier. He set down his notebook on the counter, looking around at the staff, then glanced briefly toward Emma. "I asked to speak with you all," Shaq began, his deep voice steady but powerful, "because what happened today wasn't just a mistake. It's a mindset." Emma froze. She knew he was talking about her, but his words weren't filled with anger or accusations. They were measured, deliberate, meant to make everyone think. Mr. Carter stepped forward, clearing his throat. "Before we continue, let me make something clear," he said, his tone sharp. "Mr. O'Neal isn't just a valued guest here. He's one of the owners of this cafe." Gas rippled through the staff and customers alike. The reality of Shaq's identity hit Emma like a freight train. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Lisa, still seated by the window, leaned over to her friend and whispered, "I knew he had to be someone important. He's been so calm this whole time." Shaq's eyes flicked to Emma, but only briefly. Then he addressed everyone again. "When I walk into a place like this, I don't expect special treatment. I'm not here for attention or recognition. I'm here because I believe in this cafe, in the people who run it." He paused, his gaze sweeping across the room, letting his words settle. "But what I witnessed today wasn't what we stand for. It wasn't respect. It wasn't kindness. And it certainly wasn't professionalism." Emma's hands trembled as she clasped them tightly in front of her. Every word he spoke felt like a weight pressing down on her chest. One of the younger staff members raised their hand hesitantly. "Mr. O'Neal, I didn't realize. I didn't know this would happen. Emma was—" Shaq held up a hand, silencing the young man with a calm but firm look. "This isn't about pointing fingers," he said. "This is about understanding the bigger picture." Turning slightly, he addressed Emma directly for the first time. "You made assumptions about me based on what I ordered, how I dressed, and how I look. Am I wrong?" Emma swallowed hard, her voice barely audible. "No, you're not wrong." Shaq nodded, his expression softening just slightly. "Thank you for being honest. That's a start." He leaned forward, placing his large hands on the counter. "But here's the thing. You don't know who someone is just by looking at them. You don't know their story, their struggles, or their worth. Every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with respect, whether they're here for a $2 coffee or the most expensive drink on the menu." A murmur of agreement ran through the cafe. Even customers who had been silently watching now nodded, their expressions reflective. Emma's eyes brimmed with tears, but she didn't let them fall. She couldn't bring herself to look up, but she managed to whisper, "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." Shaq cut her off gently. "Intentions matter, but so do actions. And today, your actions showed something that needs to change. Not just for you, but for everyone here. Mr. Carter stepped in again, his face a mix of disappointment and resolve. Emma, this cafe prides itself on being a welcoming place. What happened today doesn't reflect our values. We'll have to discuss your role moving forward. Emma nodded shakily, the weight of her choices settling heavily on her shoulders. Shaq straightened, looking around at the staff one last time. This isn't about punishing anyone, he said. It's about learning. If we don't change how we treat people, if we don't start leading with kindness, we fail, not just as professionals, but as people. The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the unspoken weight of his words. Finally, Shaq picked up his notebook and turned to leave. As he walked toward the door, Lisa began clapping. Slowly at first, then more confidently. Within moments, the entire cafe joined in. Emma watched as Shaq exited, her heart heavy but her mind clearer than it had been all day. The cafe was quieter now, though the weight of Shaq's words still lingered. Emma stood behind the counter, her hands gripping its edge. Her knuckles were white, her mind racing. The murmurs of customers, the silent stares of her co-workers, it was all too much. She wanted to shrink, to disappear, but there was no hiding from what had happened. Mr. Carter, the manager, walked over, his expression stern but not unkind. Emma, he began, his voice low but firm, we need to talk. She nodded, barely able to meet his gaze. I know, she whispered. The other staff members busied themselves, but it was clear their attention was still on Emma. Marcus, the barista who had spoken up earlier, gave her a sidelong glance. His face softened, but he said nothing. Mr. Carter gestured toward the back office. Let's step in here for a moment. Emma hesitated, then followed him. She felt the weight of every step, as if the entire cafe were watching her. Once inside the small office, Mr. Carter closed the door and took a seat across from her. The hum of the cafe outside was muffled, but Emma could still feel its presence pressing down on her. Do you understand what just happened out there? Mr. Carter asked, leaning forward slightly. Emma swallowed hard. I do, she said, her voice trembling. I disrespected a customer. No, not just a customer. I disrespected a person. Mr. Carter nodded slowly. That's right. And it wasn't just about Shaq's status or his ownership of this cafe. It was about how you treated someone based on assumptions. That kind of behavior has no place here. Tears welled up in Emma's eyes. I didn't realize. You didn't think it mattered, Mr. Carter said, cutting her off gently. You thought you could get away with it because he didn't react. But respect isn't about who someone is or how they respond. It's about who you are and how you choose to act. Emma wiped at her eyes, nodding. I'm so sorry. I know I messed up. I don't even know how to fix this. Mr. Carter sighed, leaning back in his chair. Fixing this isn't going to be easy. It's going to take time, effort, and a real willingness to change. Do you think you're ready for that? Yes, Emma said immediately. I'll do whatever it takes. He studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good, because this isn't just about keeping your job. It's about being a better person. You'll need to apologize to the staff and the customers you disrespected. And I'll be setting up some training sessions on customer service and inclusivity. You'll attend all of them. Emma nodded again, her throat tight with emotion. I'll do it, I promise. The door to the office opened slightly, and Marcus peeked in. Sorry to interrupt, but Shaq's still outside. I think he's waiting to talk to Emma. Emma's heart sank, her stomach twisted into knots. But she nodded. Okay, she whispered, standing up. As she stepped out of the office, the air in the cafe felt different. Customers were still seated, but the room had an undercurrent of something unspoken, an expectation. Shaq stood by the door, his massive frame silhouetted against the sunlight streaming in through the glass. He turned as she approached, his expression calm and unreadable. Emma stopped a few feet away, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Mr. O'Neal, she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to apologize for everything. I was rude, disrespectful, and wrong. I made assumptions about you, and I treated you in a way no one deserves to be treated. Shaq looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. Apology accepted, he said simply. Her breath hitched in relief, "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. He glanced around the cafe, then back at her. "What matters now is what you do moving forward," he said. "It's not just about saying the right words. It's about living them. Think you can do that?" Emma nodded vigorously. "Yes, I can. I will." Shaq smiled faintly, then extended his hand. She hesitated for a moment, then took it, her smaller hand swallowed by his. "Good luck," he said, his tone warm but firm. As he walked out, the cafe felt lighter. Customers who had been quietly observing broke into murmurs, some nodding approvingly. Emma exhaled deeply, a mix of shame and hope filling her chest. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time that day, she felt like she had a chance to make it right. By the next morning, the cafe was no longer just a cozy spot for coffee. It had become the center of a viral storm. The first spark came from Lisa, the young professional who had been sitting near the window during the incident. Unable to shake the memory of Shaq's calm demeanor and Emma's rude remarks, she had taken to social media. Her post was simple but direct. "Watched Shaquille O'Neal get mocked at a cafe for ordering a plain coffee. Little did the waitress know, he owns the place. He handled it like a boss. Respect, Cerizarn. Kindness matters." The attached photo of Shaq, seated at his corner table with his notebook and coffee, carried a quiet power. His calm composure in the midst of blatant disrespect spoke volumes. By noon, the post had been shared thousands of times. Comments flooded in, ranging from admiration for Shaq to outrage at the waitress's behavior. "Can't believe people still act like this in 2025. Major respect to Shaq for staying so cool. Let this be a lesson. Always treat people with kindness. You never know who they really are." Why would she even think it's okay to treat anyone that way? So glad Shaq exposed it calmly. News outlets quickly picked up the story. Headlines like, "Shaquille O'Neal teaches cafe waitress a lesson in respect," and "Rude waitress mocked a legend, and here's how he handled it," dominated feeds. The cafe's management was caught off guard. By midday, Mr. Carter had issued a public statement. "We deeply regret the incident that took place at our establishment. Respect and kindness are core to our values, and we are committed to ensuring every customer feels welcome. We are addressing the matter internally and taking steps to prevent such behavior in the future." The apology helped ease some of the backlash, but the spotlight was now on Emma. Social media users scoured the cafe's reviews and posts, calling for accountability. "Who's this waitress? She needs to learn a serious lesson. This isn't just about Shaq. No one deserves to be treated like that." The pressure mounted, but Shaq remained silent. He didn't post or comment. He didn't need to. His actions in the moment had already spoken louder than words. At the cafe, the staff was tense. Marcus scrolled through his phone during his break, his eyebrows raised as he read the comments. "This is wild," he murmured to a coworker. Emma, sitting in the break room, felt the weight of the world pressing down on her. She had seen the posts, the comments, the headlines. It was as if the entire world had seen her worst moment. But it wasn't just the shame that weighed on her. It was Shaq's words. "It's not just about saying the right words. It's about living them." Later that evening, the story reached the evening news. A local anchor's voice filled living rooms across the city. Shaquille O'Neal, NBA legend and philanthropist, faced unexpected disrespect at a cafe he co-owns. The story has sparked a larger conversation about bias, kindness, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. The segment showed the photo Lisa had taken, followed by clips of interviews with customers who had witnessed the incident. Lisa herself appeared on screen, her voice steady and firm. "I think the lesson here is simple," she said. "Treat everyone with respect. You never know what someone's story is, or how your actions might reflect on you." By the next day, the cafe saw an unusual spike in customers. People came not just for coffee, but to see the place where the story had unfolded. "Is this the spot?" a man asked Marcus at the counter. Marcus nodded. "Yep, but we're hoping the next chapter is a better one." Shaq stopped by in the afternoon. He greeted the staff with his usual warmth, but didn't linger. As he left, a group of customers clapped softly, their admiration clear. Emma stood at the back watching him go. She felt a pang of guilt, but also a flicker of determination. This wasn't the end of her story. The incident had sparked more than just outrage. It had ignited a conversation about kindness in everyday interactions. Community leaders spoke out, calling for better training in customer service industries. Inspired by the moment, Shaq announced a new initiative the following week, Serve with Respect, a program aimed at promoting kindness and inclusion in cafes, restaurants, and other service spaces. At the press conference, Shaq kept his message simple. It's not about coffee. It's not about me. It's about how we treat people every single day. His words resonated deeply. They weren't just about one cafe or one waitress. They were about creating a culture where everyone felt valued. Emma watched the press conference from home, tears streaming down her face. She wasn't proud of how her actions had sparked this moment, but she was grateful for the opportunity to learn and grow. This was her chance to rewrite her story. The cafe had returned to its usual rhythm, but for Emma, nothing felt the same. Every time she stepped behind the counter, she felt the weight of judgment, the whispers from customers, the wary glances from her coworkers, and the unmistakable tension in the air reminded her of the damage she had caused. It wasn't just about her mistake. It was about what it had revealed. She had let her biases define her actions, and now she was paying the price. Shaq's words lingered in her mind. It's not just about saying the right words. It's about living them. He had accepted her apology, but that wasn't the end. If anything, it was just the beginning. Emma knew she had to do more than apologize. She had to prove to herself, to her coworkers, and to the customers that she could change. The first step was accepting the consequences. Mr. Carter had called her into his office a few days after the incident. His tone was measured, but there was no mistaking the disappointment in his eyes. Emma, he began, we've decided to suspend you for 2 weeks. During this time, you'll complete training on inclusivity, customer service, and bias awareness. This isn't just for appearances. It's because you need it. If you want to come back, you'll have to show us that you've learned from this. Emma nodded, her throat tightening. She didn't argue. She knew he was right. The suspension gave her time to reflect. Alone in her small apartment, Emma thought back to the day it had all gone wrong. She replayed every moment, her sarcastic remarks, her dismissive attitude, her assumptions about Shaq. Shame clawed at her chest, but alongside it was a growing determination. She couldn't undo what she had done, but she could make sure it never happened again. During her suspension, Emma enrolled in workshops at a local community center. The sessions were eye-opening. She listened as speakers shared their experiences with discrimination, bias, and the impact of words. For the first time, she truly understood the harm she had caused. One speaker, a young man named Caleb, spoke about being dismissed because of his appearance. People think they know you because of how you look, he said, but they don't. And when they act on those assumptions, it's not just hurtful, it's dehumanizing. His words struck a chord. Emma realized how small actions, like a smirk or a snide remark, could leave a lasting scar. When her suspension ended, Emma returned to the cafe with a new perspective. She was nervous, unsure if her coworkers or the customers would accept her, but she didn't let that stop her. She approached Marcus first, her voice steady but sincere. Marcus, I'm sorry for how I acted. You stood up for what was right, and I didn't listen. I respect you for that, and I hope I can earn back your trust. Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. I appreciate that, Emma. Let's see where this goes. The hardest moment came when a regular customer, who had witnessed the incident with Shaq, walked in. Emma braced herself, unsure of what to say. But instead of avoiding her, the customer smiled. It takes courage to face your mistakes, she said. Keep going. Emma's redemption wasn't instant, but it was genuine. She threw herself into her work, treating every customer with kindness and respect. She started small, offering a warm smile and a genuine, "How's your day?" to each person who approached the counter. Over time, the tension eased. The whispers faded. Emma began to feel a sense of purpose she hadn't known before. Shaq's initiative, Serve with Respect, gained momentum, and Emma volunteered to help with workshops. She shared her story, admitting her mistakes and the lessons she had learned. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Each time she spoke, she felt a little lighter, as if the weight of her past actions was being replaced by something stronger, a commitment to change. One day, Shaq visited the cafe again. Emma spotted him as he walked in and immediately approached him. "Mr. O'Neal," she said, her voice steady, "I just wanted to thank you, not just for forgiving me, but for giving me the chance to do better." Shaq smiled, his warm presence as reassuring as ever. "You're on the right track," he said. "Keep it up." Emma knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she was ready. Redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about progress, and for the first time in a long time, she felt like she was moving forward. The cafe hummed with quiet energy. Customers filled the tables, chatting softly over their lattes and pastries. It was business as usual, but something had changed. The air felt lighter, the smiles more genuine. For Emma, this wasn't just another day. It was a reflection of how far she'd come. She moved behind the counter with ease, greeting each customer warmly. "Good morning. What can I get for you today?" Her voice carried a sincerity that hadn't been there before. The usual patrons noticed. Lisa, who had been among the first to call out Emma's behavior, now made a point to stop by the cafe more often. "You're doing great," Lisa said one morning, as Emma handed her a cappuccino. "It's like a completely different place." Emma smiled, a genuine one that reached her eyes. "Thank you," she said. "It means a lot to hear that." Shaq's initiative, Serve with Respect, had grown into something bigger than anyone expected. The campaign wasn't just about cafes anymore. Restaurants, retail stores, and service industries across the city had adopted its principles. Workshops were being held regularly, and businesses were eager to join. One afternoon, the cafe hosted one of these workshops. Emma stood nervously at the front of the room, facing a group of new trainees. It was the first time she'd been asked to share her story publicly. She hesitated for a moment, then took a deep breath and began. "I used to think that how someone looked or acted told me everything I needed to know about them," she started. "I judged people without even realizing it. But then one day I made a mistake, a big one, and it forced me to see myself for who I really was." The room was silent as she spoke. Emma recounted her encounter with Shaq, the rude remarks, the assumptions, and the lessons she'd learned. "What I did wasn't just wrong, it was harmful, but the person I hurt didn't fight back with anger. He showed me kindness and gave me a chance to change, and that changed everything." When she finished, there was a brief pause before the room erupted into applause. Emma felt a wave of relief and pride. She wasn't proud of her past, but she was proud of the person she was becoming. The impact of Shaq's initiative went beyond the workshops. Local schools began incorporating its principles into their curriculums, teaching kids about empathy and respect from an early age. Businesses started recognizing employees who embodied the values of kindness and inclusion. At the heart of it all was Shaq. He attended every major event, his presence alone inspiring others to take the message seriously. During one such event, he addressed a packed auditorium. "This isn't just about customer service," he said, his deep voice resonating through the room. "It's about how we treat people, everywhere, every day. Respect isn't earned by money or status. It's something we owe to each other simply because we're human." Emma watched from the back of the room, her chest tightening with emotion. She thought about where she had been just a few months ago, angry, defensive, and blind to her own flaws. Now she stood among people working to build a better world, and she knew she belonged there. As the event ended, Shaq walked over to her. "You did good today," he said, his tone warm. "Thank you," Emma replied. "For everything." He smiled. "Keep it going. This is just the beginning." Months later, the cafe held a small ceremony to honor Marcus, the barista who had stood up for what was right that day. Shaq presented him with an award for integrity and leadership. "You showed courage when it mattered most," Shaq said, "and that's what this is all about." As Marcus accepted the award, the cafe erupted in applause. Emma clapped the loudest, tears streaming down her face. The story didn't end there. The cafe became a symbol of change, a place where people felt welcome and valued. Emma became a mentor to new employees, sharing her story to help them understand the importance of treating everyone with dignity. In her quiet moments, Emma often thought back to the day it all began. She remembered the shame, the regret, and most importantly, the lesson. It wasn't just about her mistake. It was about what she chose to do afterward. Real change, she realized, wasn't a single moment. It was a series of choices made every day to be better.